Hello and welcome back to State of the Division. This time with the UFC Hangover card, UFC 301. Overall, this is just an okay card. It's a lot of contender series guys looking to build records, looking to build reputation. It's a lot of people who have like 3 fights in the UFC looking to go to the 4th and possibly start entering the contender ranks. The title fight's pretty good. Jose Aldo makes a return. Always fun to see him on a card. I'm a sucker for Michael Pereira fighting. He's just a fun fighter to watch. Iho Pretoria is someone I just have tangentially kind of followed for the last few times. And there are some interesting fighters on this card. It's just, as a whole, this is very much the, hey, we scheduled everybody last card. We're just going to give it 2 months, and we'll be back with a good card for 303. That being said, let's jump right in. Housekeeping and the Butcher's Bill. Now, starting off with housekeeping, you see the problem on hand. I had a rather abysmal last card. I went 5-6. I was 50-50 on Gaethje Holloway. I went with Gaethje thinking he could overcome Holloway's swarming. I was wrong there, and I will take that willingly. I will beat myself over picking Holly Holm off Veteran Magic. That was very much because I felt comfortable and I wanted to give a nod to Holm. I should not have done that, as that has put me in a very bad position. I am now 28, 22, and 1 on the year, which is really bad, and I've had 2 bad cards in a row. This very much needs to stop soon. We do have a Butcher's Bill, a very small one for this card, which I'm thankful for. We avoided a lot of ruinings so far, and I'm hoping that keeps up. At least at the time of writing and recording this, nothing terrible has gone wrong. Makhmut Muradov is out of his bout against Michael Pereira and was replaced by Iho Pretoria, something I am kind of thankful for, just because I've had Pretoria on State of the Division a few times, and he's been an interesting fighter. That being said, we're going to jump right in. Kicking off this post-300 Hangover card, 13-4, Alessandro No Costa looks for the rebound against 9-2, Kevin El Gallo Negro Borjas. Borjas is 2 years younger, either an inch his way or dead even height across the board, because Sherdog and UFC cannot agree, with a definite 1 inch in reach rolling his way. Costa has a pretty small UFC sample size, but looking at his career, he is definitely a finisher with 6 career submission wins and 4 KO wins. Now, these haven't exactly shown up in the UFC with only 1 split decision win and 1 KO win so far, but the submission threat is there. Looking at the numbers, he rocks a 3.75 to 3.61 in striking, which does speak to his ability to bring out power and at least hang in there with most opponents. It is worth noting that in his 2 losses, he was outstruck 37-17 and 74-54. Now, as I mentioned, he has 6 career submission wins, but in the UFC, only has a .31 takedown average, with his only loss to Urseg having him with a minute or more of ground control. Borjas is another relatively new fighter, so I do not have really any data on him. In his career, he has got 8 KO wins and only 1 decision. He definitely prefers to hang on the feet, but has the ability to survive on the ground, as he was able to overcome Victor Diaz in his Contender Series fight, who secured 5 takedowns on him. Costa catches that narrow nod from Vegas, and I'm gonna run with that. Borjas looked like he got overwhelmed on the feet in his last fight, and Costa looks good on the feet with some KO power. I'm not very confident, so I'm relying on the money lenders to kind of figure this out. So I am going to go with Costa kind of based on Vegas and based off the little I saw. 19-4, Ismail Mareta Bonfim, who I'm pretty sure was on one of the early episodes of this, looks for the win against the man with the best mustache in combat sports. 14-3, Vince From Hell Pichel. Bonfim is 13 years younger, which is not the largest age gap on this card somehow, at 28. 1 or 2 inches shorter, with Mr. From Hell taking a whole inch in reach, 72 inches to 71. Bonfim does have a limited UFC sample size, but as a whole has stood out as a striker. He has a KO win over Terrence McKinney and an 85-45 unanimous decision win against Nariam Abasov. Outside the UFC, he has 9 career KO wins, 4 submission, and 6 decision. Numbers-wise, in terms of striking, carries a 4.91 to 2.66, which shows his high pace, not to mention the power he's able to call on to stop fighters. I do also want to mention that he has some strike variety, which provides him with some solid weapons to surprise people with. In terms of the ground, works with a 1.11 takedown average and only 1 takedown in each of his UFC wins. He does have submission ability, though none have been landed in the UFC, so take that as you will. Pichel is much more of a grinder in comparison, a 3.56 to 2.50 in striking, and hasn't been severely outstruck really in any of his UFC losses. He does have a pretty reliable ground game with a 3.0 average and the tendency to stack them in fights where they actually land. He does only have a 23% takedown defense, which has worked against him in a few fights where he was unable to recover and get the control back. Bonfim is the heavy Vegas favorite, and I will agree. Pichel isn't bad. He's a grinder on the feet, and I don't think he can finish Bonfim, who has only lost by submission so far. He has 4 submission losses. With that in mind, I think his athleticism, being 13 years younger, is going to give him a major edge over Pichel, at least in terms of the weapons he can bring out and use. all that being put together gives Bonfim the edge in my mind. 6-2, Dion the Witch Barbosa looks for the win against fellow debutee. 5-0-1, Ernesta, I'm so sorry, Kerchakate. Ernesta is 6 years younger at 25, 3 inches taller with 5 in reach, also going her way. I don't got a lot going here for either fighter, but what I do have for Barbosa, Painter is a bit of a finisher with a preference for the ground with 3 career submission and 3 decision wins. In her Contender Series fight, she won in the first with an armbar, outstriking her opponent 4-3, securing a takedown and getting taken down once, though she did take the control time lead. Ernesta, because I'm not saying that last name, looks to be more of a grinder with the last 3 wins all being decisions. Though she does have 2 KO wins on record, in her Contender Series fight, she outstruck her opponent 184-168 and secured 1 takedown with 41 seconds of control time for a split decision win. Barbosa receives the Vegas nod, and being boring, I'm going to agree. I got so little to go off of here, and I'm just looking at the numbers. Barbosa won her fight pretty soundly. Karachate, Ernesta, did have to go to split decision, which does not give me pause, but in comparing the two fighters, I'll take in this battle of little information, I'll take the fighter that took the finish win and has kind of that history of good ground game versus the fighter that seemed to struggle a little bit and had to rely on the feet a lot more. I expect this fight to go to the ground, so I'm going to run with the fighter that looks to be good on the ground. UFC newcomer, a thing you're going to hear a lot. 9-1 Mauricio Rufy looks to win his UFC debut against 17-7 Jamie Mullarkey. Rufy is 2 years younger at 27. Height is a complete screwball here because Mullarkey is listed at 5'8 on SureDog, but 6'0 on the UFC site, so the numbers here are either 3 inches taller for Rufy or 1 inch taller for Mullarkey, with reach being 1 inch definitely going to Rufy. Rufy is the newcomer, so not a lot of UFC data, but for career records holds 9 straight KOs, so he is definitely a fighter with a preference for the feet, generally finishing the fight in the first, only 4 of his fights going past that. In his Contender Series fight, he went late into the third, 4:45, and finished it by KO, outstriking his opponent 70-60. I don't know if he's a power puncher, but as it stands, he looks more like a swarmer over straight power. Mullarkey is coming in as the veteran here and looks like an awkward crossbreed of a finisher and a grinder. By that I mean he has 10 KO wins in his career, only 2 in the UFC, with his other 3 UFC wins being decision. He also has been finished 3 times, losing by KO twice. Numbers-wise, he carries a 4.46 to 4.49, which looks like finisher numbers, but he hasn't seemed to have gotten that power to connect and instead has been caught by other opponents' power. His takedown game backs up his strikes and sits at a 2.42 average that he's been able to use for chunks of control time. Vegas has decided to run with Rufy here, and I will agree. I agonize over this a little bit just because I think Mullarkey has a ground game and I think that could be dangerous, but at the same time, Mullarkey doesn't always shoot a takedown. He'll go a stretch of fights without shooting one, and I think, if I remember correctly, he's on a stretch where he hasn't shot. He also has a tendency to wade into firefights and get KO'd, and given that all 9 of Rufy's wins are KO wins, I'm inclined to give the nod to him. I imagine if this fight goes to the ground and Rufy has no way to counter it, which I don't know if he does, Mullarkey can win. But on the feet, I think it goes to Rufy. And if Rufy can counter Mullarkey's takedowns, it stays on the feet and it stays in Rufy's ballpark. I think he has more paths to win. 13-4, Joaquim Neto BJJ. No idea what that means. Silva looks for 2 in a row against 14-2-1. Drakkar Klose. Silva is a year younger at 35 with either dead even height or an inch going to Klose with a definite reach rolling to Klose. Silva has been hot and cold as of late, but does come across as a kill or be killed finisher with definite power punching ability, and with that, the ability to come back when down in a fight. Going by the numbers, he racks a 3.61 to 4.51 in striking, which does highlight his struggles with getting outpaced on the feet and having to come back in a few of those fights. Now, the power punching does keep him in a fight, but it hasn't been the greatest comeback tool. Now, he does carry a 0.5 takedown average, and as a tool, it's incredibly inconsistent. It's seeming to depend on match per situation whether it gets used or not. Klose isn't a hot and cold fighter, but he is a bit streaky when it comes to wins and losses. Stylistically, he's been more of a grinder in the UFC, though he is riding 2 finished wins in his last 3, but that does only bring his ratio to 2 out of 8 UFC wins being finishes. In the numbers, he racks a 4.33 to 3.40 in striking, which does highlight the functional nature of his striking as being good enough against most opponents to take a striking lead and hold on to it for dear life. With his takedowns, they sit at 1.78, backing it up pretty well and consistently generating okay chunks of control time. Like 3 minutes isn't bad off 2 takedowns, but it is incredible compared to some other fighters, kind of riding that straight middle ground. It honestly sums up Klose's game pretty well. I don't think he excels in any major category, but I think he is a solid fighter down the middle, capable of doing well enough on the feet or well enough on the ground to win a fair number of fights. Vegas gives the narrow edge to Klose, and I'm going to agree. In part, it's just these are 2 kind of similar fighters, but also Klose is riding the hot hand, which is important here, I feel. And secondly, Close has proven durability to go the distance in a lot of fights, and given that Silva's main path to victory has been getting the finish, coming back while down, I think someone like Close, who's been a bit of a grinder, gone the distance in a lot of fights, and kind of controlled fights, that gives him the edge here in enduring whatever Silva can bring and taking the fight to the final bell. So in the end, I am going to pick Close here. Moving on to the prelims. 12-2, Jean Lord Silva looks to keep the winning going against 13-2, William the Jaguar Gomes, or Gomes. Gomes is a year younger at 26, 5 inches taller, with 4 in reach, also going his way. Silva is relatively new to the UFC, but is riding a 9-fight win streak with 2 wins counted on his UFC record. One of them is a Contender Series fight, though. Career-wise, he sits at 9 KO, 2 submission, and a whole 1 decision win. So there is some definite preference for the feet and some noticeable punching power. I don't know about strike variety or how he compared to his opponents in his fights outside the UFC. What I can say is that for the UFC fights, he took an 87-71 striking lead in a decision win, followed by a 25-11 striking lead in a KO win. He does also have 2 landed takedowns in the UFC, but minimal control time followed those. Gomes has 3 UFC fights and really comes across as a striker, though he seems to flip between finishing and grinding to the finish with 7 KO and 5 decision wins over his career, 2 decision and 1 KO in the UFC. Once again, I got a small sample size, so these numbers probably should go with some salt, but he carries a 2.62 to 1.49 in striking and does tend to take that striking lead in most of his fights. In addition, he carries a 1.06 takedown average, but outside of his fight with Jono Aarons, really doesn't generate a whole lot of control time. Does have an 81% takedown defense, but when taken down, has been able to fight back to his feet, so he's not completely dead in the water. Vegas leans Silva here. I'm gonna disagree and run Gomes. This is very much a gut feeling, but I like how Gomes lines up here, since he should be able to endure a lot of Silva's offense, and he's been able to play the decision game a few times, so if he can't get a finish, I don't think he's dead in the water. Has a good takedown defense, so if this fight wants to go to the ground, I think he can keep it on the feet, and if he wants to go to the ground, I think he might be able to take it there. I don't know how Silva is on the ground. I assume he's pretty solid, but I think they match up well enough on the feet that I think Gomes can grind out a win here. 16-3, Elves Brenner looks to roll to 4-0 in the UFC against the newcomer. 12-1-1. I'm so sorry. Mixabek Orobai. Dear God. Even age across the board, even height across the board, only measurable difference being 2 inches in reach rolling to Orobai. Now, Brenner only has 3 UFC fights. Common thing on this card. So as I've said a few times, grain of salt required. In the numbers, he runs with a 4.64 to 5.05 in striking, speaks to his toughness and punching power, serving as a great equalizer, given he's won his last 2 fights by KO. However, his bread and butter is the submission game, with 11 of his career wins coming that way. Now, this hasn't shown up in the UFC so far, given a .93 takedown average and absolutely 0 submission attempts thrown, but I'm very much assuming this is just a small blip in the radar and not a trend going forward. But some fighters have just fallen in love with the striking and not gone back to what they started out with. Orobai is a finisher with 6 career KO and 5 career submission wins, and has shown the ability to neutralize another fighter's game completely. He slowed down Uris Medic's striking, took him down 7 times, and won the fight 4 minutes and 12 seconds into the second round. Orobai is the favorite here, and I'm going to agree just because I have a complete lack of data on both of these fighters. I don't feel comfortable picking Brenner for anything he's really shown in the UFC. You have a dude who has 11 submission wins, winning by strikes. And then you have someone who has a really good striking game and a pretty good submission game, coming in with no UFC fights, beating Uris Medic, who, no offense, is kind of one of those guys I don't know where he slots into a roster, where he slots on the roster yet. So I'm going to roll with Vegas. I'm going to pick Orobai, and I'm kind of hoping the money counters got their stuff right. UFC veteran 16-7, Carolina Kolowaikovic, I'm so sorry, looks to keep the wins coming against 15-5, Yasmin Lucindo. Now, in one of the biggest age gaps I ever remember, and the biggest on this card, Lucindo is 16 years younger, either 1 inch taller or dead even, with 2 in reach rolling her way. Carolina, because I can't say that last name, is a grinder through and through with only 1 finished win on her UFC resume, and it was 4 fights ago in 2022. Her numbers back this up with a 5.92 to 5.55 in striking, speaking to her durability and ability to at least match her opponents, if not outpace them. Worth noting is she did outstrike her opponents 139 to 68 and 141 to 99 respectively in her last 2 fights. Now, she can be outpaced on the feet, but normally they don't pull too far away. She does have a .39 takedown average, sorry, .36 takedown average, but when she does shoot and land, she racks up chunks of control time. But as a whole, it feels situational matchup based and not a consistent thing she's going for. Lucindo only has 3 UFC fights, so the numbers are a little skewed. But as a whole, she skews towards a finisher with 8 career KO wins and 4 decision wins, followed by 3 submission wins. In the UFC, she runs with a 3.33 to 3.23 in striking, but did outstrike her opponent handily in her decision win by 14. 2019. When it comes to the ground game, she works with a 2.33, and in one of her fights did take a decent chunk of control time. There obviously is a submission threat there with one landed in her last fight, but I don't know how often she throws those. Vegas likes Lucindo by a good margin, and given a 16-year age difference, I'm inclined to agree. I just think she's going to have the better edge here, and while Carolina has a 74 takedown defense, I think Lucindo is going to shoot often. I think she's going to shoot a lot, and I think going down once takes the ball right out of Carolina's court and puts it in someone who can land a submission, who can work that, and against a grinder like Carolina, whose bread and butter is staying on the feet, avoiding the ground and avoiding that, I'm going to give the edge to Lucindo here based on athleticism and based on her ability to take down her opponents. Ending off these prelims, 17-1, Jack Tank Shore wins dumbest ring name, looking for 2 in a row against 16-3-1, Joanderson Tubaro Brito. Even age across the board, either 1 inch in favor of Shore or no difference at all in height, with 1 inch in reach going to Brito. Shore likes to finish by submission with 3 in the UFC and 9 in his career, but in the UFC he went through 2021 and 2022 without a submission before finally securing one again in 2023. Now in the numbers, his striking sits at a 3.84 to 2.20, which isn't surprising given he looks to be such a ground-focused fighter. With those numbers, he's been able to hang within spitting distance, if not take the striking lead in most of his fights. He does have 4 career KO wins, but his last one was in 2018, so I'm not sure how much we can be expecting that to show up now. About that ground game, he carries a 3.42 takedown average, and in each of his UFC wins, landed at least 1 takedown for, on the low end, 2 minutes of ground control. But obviously looking behind that all, the submission game that has proven successful, even if it disappears for a time. Brito is an equal opportunity finisher with 7 KO and 7 submission wins, and the odd 2 decision wins. In the numbers, he is similar with a 3.32 to 2.62 in striking, but comparatively is much more of a power puncher, with all but one of those KO victories coming in the first. Now, his takedown game sits at a 3.40 with an aggressive submission game. He does have the ability to secure long runs of ground control time, but given the finish ability, hasn't had to. The narrow favorite is Brito. I'm going to go with Shore here. They have very similar numbers all across the board. Look to be evenly matched in striking, but I think Shore can either survive the power, and given that he has the longer time in ring between the two fighters, averaging almost 11 minutes, I'm going to give the edge to him. I think he's been in the ring with a lot of dangerous punchers, a lot of people that can put people away, and he's found ways around that. He's very good at dragging fights out, taking them a long time, and both have a dangerous submission game, so I kind of expect Shore to either be able to avoid a lot of Brito's attempts if they do go to the ground, or in turn throw his own that can force Brito to have to adjust and abandon certain things. I think this will be a close fight, but I'm going to kind of go with Shore's grinding ability, able to drag this fight out and kind of neutralize Brito's attempts to finish here. It's a little bit of a long shot, but in my head it makes sense for me, and I think Shore matches up pretty well against Brito. Kicking off the main card, 17-7-1, Paul Bear Jew Craig wins best ring name and looks for the quick bounce back against 15-1-0-1, Caio the Natural Barallo. Caio is 5 years younger. Craig is either 2 or 1 inch taller if you take Sherdog's listing of Caio's height at 6'2", or if you take the UFC's listing, he might be 6 or 5 inches taller because they list Caio at 5'10". Someone explained to me how you get that big of a difference between the height on 2 separate websites that's entire thing is cataloging the heights of fighters. Either way, 1 inch in reach goes to Craig. Craig is Craig, and I'm hard-pressed to find the motivation to continue this. I feel like it sums it up pretty well. That being said, Craig is a dangerous ground-focused fighter with a preference for the finish, but has proven the ability to finish really anywhere in a fight. With the takedowns, he works at 1.76. Doesn't always secure ground control time, but has proven the ability to be very dangerous at a bottom guard with his submissions. Striking is very much in line with grappler striking of 2.42 to 2.86, with the aforementioned ability to put it away on the feet, though on the feet he's much more vulnerable, having been finished that way for 4 of his 7 losses. Caio is also a ground-focused fighter, though he is not very submission-heavy with only 4 career submissions, so he leans more towards the grinding style. And in the numbers, he carries a 2.16 with the ability to stack takedowns, even rack up absurd amounts of control time with a single take. His striking is as expected for a ground grinder, 2.73 to 1.98, pretty low totals, slows it down a lot. So you don't really see high striking totals in most of his fights, which plays into his game plan of keeping it in his wheelhouse and keeping the fight slow. Vegas gives the nod to Caio, and I will agree. Craig is dangerous in a fight. He's capable of finishing on the feet, not his main strength, but he can do it. And he's definitely capable of finishing on the ground, which does make this dangerous. But Caio's a grinder with a fairly solid ground game as well, so I think he'll be able to take Craig down. I think he's good enough to avoid a lot of Craig's submissions and avoid being locked away on that. And on the feet, his striking is good enough. I think he can slow it down, put it against the cage, and prevent Craig from landing any big KO shots that he might be going for. This fight feels a little closer than Vegas had it, I feel, but I will give the nod to Caio, kind of based on the 5 years of age. I think the grinding style he has is good enough to match Craig. And while Craig can always finish on the ground, as I've said a few times now, I think Kyle's good enough to avoid it or endure most of Craig's ground game to at least keep himself safe. 30-11-0-2. Michael Nemoliador Pereira looks to keep the wins flowing against 20-5 Ihor the Duelist Potieria. Potieria is 3 years younger at 27, 2 inches taller with another 2 in reach also going his way. Pereira is an explosive, dynamic fighter capable of taking the KO or the submission win. All in all, he's a dangerous fighter who always seems to push the pace and work for the finish in his fights. In the numbers, he is a 5.15 to 3.71 in striking, which reflects the high octane pace and a bit of wild style he carries. As I mentioned, power is always a factor with him, and that carries over a bit to his dynamic style. It is worth noting his last KO loss was in 2018, with his 2 most recent losses, 2019-2020, coming by DQ and decision. So the toughness and durability is there, even if I feel like his striking defense isn't the greatest at times. Takedowns sit at a 1.55, and it feels like a game time decision based on the flow of the fight and the situation Pereira is in. But once again, worth noting, doesn't need a takedown to set up a submission and can work out of position or if opponents misplays. Potieria is a striker through and through with a 5.19 to 5.01 on the feet, which does speak to his tendency to keep the striking close in most cases or get caught in firefights with other fighters. Does have decent KO power with 2 of his 3 UFC wins coming that way, and the one decision having him outstrike his opponent 67-32. It does look like he has no concept of a takedown game with a 0.00 average, which isn't outlandish, but him only having a 57% takedown defense isn't great, as we have seen him be taken down and controlled for chunks of time as a result. Heavy favorite here is Pereira, and I really have to agree. I think in striking, Pereira is more dynamic and can pack more power. Potieria can finish, yes, but Pereira has had more success as of late, so he's the hot hand. He has a ground game, which I'm not sure how good Potieria can match up against, plus the ability to throw submissions from a trip, a slip, a knockdown against the cage, a misplay, or anything like that. Pereira just has more weapons, and while Potieria can win off the right shot at the right time, I think Pereira has more ways to land that shot, has more ways to win. I think more cards just go Pereira's way than they do Potiera's. 37-19, Anthony Lionheart Smith looks to get back to winning against 11-0, Vitor Merciless Petrino. Petrino is 9 years younger, 1 or 2 inches shorter, but he does steal an inch in reach. Smith is a streaky fighter with some dangerous finishability. By that I mean in his last 10 fights, he has won, lost 2, won 3, lost 2, won 1, and lost 1 going into this fight. Looking at the numbers, he works with a 3.21 to 4.47, which both speaks to his ability to win pretty quickly, but also lose later in fights, skewing the numbers a bit in odd ways. In his wins, he does take that striking lead, and if he doesn't get the finish, he works it pretty well throughout the fight. In terms of takedowns, he's a .49 average and pretty consistently throws them, but doesn't always need them to get submissions. I will say he's more often finished on the feet in striking exchanges versus being finished by submission on the ground. Now, Petrino is obviously the hot hand given the undefeated streak and definitely leans into the striking more, with 2 of his 5 UFC wins coming by KO and 7 of his career wins coming that way. On the numbers, he runs with a 274 to 249 in striking, which highlights how his power has served as the equalizer in addition to toughness to hang in these fights. He can pull ahead in the striking but outside the Contender Series fight hasn't really done so, with his biggest lead being 11 total strikes. He does have a 3.86 takedown average that he uses to good effect for either chunks of ground control time or even just straight up disruption. Vegas takes Petrino by a heavy margin, and I will agree. Smith is very streaky, so I do lean towards the hot hand here especially, but also it's kind of in the case of a lot of what Petrino does, his striking ability to hang in and bring power, and then a good enough ground game from what I've looked at to counter. All of that comes together to really counter a lot of what Smith has been able to do recently. I just don't think there's a lot of things that Smith can do to overcome Petrino's skill set and his ability to win a fight, and that puts Smith really far behind and gives Petrino the advantage. Could Smith win? Yeah, but I think it's a lot harder for him to win this fight than it is for Petrino to either grind it to the finish as he does or take a KO win here. For the co-main event, 19-4, Jonathan Dragon Martinez squares up with the living legend, 31-8, Jose Jr. Aldo. Martinez is 7 years younger at 30. Height is either even or 1 inch rolling to Martinez, with reach being dead even across the board. Martinez is a solid all-around striker with definite finishability that isn't always there, but does seem to be lurking in the wings. Going to the numbers, he carries a 4.54 to a 3.76 in striking, and while he does definitely pull ahead in his wins, the amount he pulls ahead is always in question. Some fights runs ahead 22 strikes, and in others he's ahead by 9. He does also seem to have good strike variety, which bolsters his offense, and when it comes to takedowns, he carries a .44 average, average, but also doesn't need a takedown for control time, as seen in his fight with Said Nurmagomedov, where he took 6 minutes of control with 0 landed takedowns. So there's an ability to counter and work from other positions. Aldo is incredibly similar stylistically, with 3.57 to 3.74 in striking, though at this point in his career the power isn't always there, especially as of late, but he has remarkably solid style, is able to match most of his opponents on the feet. I will say that some fighters have outmatched him on the feet, but his last finish loss was in 2020, so the durability is still there. Now his takedown game sits at a .49, but similar to Martinez, he has been able to take control without takedowns and only shoots them in generally situations where he's either needs a disruption or they're very beneficial to him. Vegas leans Martinez here, and I'm going to disagree and run with Aldo. Both fighters match up very similarly, with the biggest difference being 7 years in age, and I think Aldo is good enough to kind of neutralize that a little bit with in-ring experience and kind of knowing a lot of tricks here. I don't think the ground game is going to be a huge thing. Both fighters don't tend to shoot that often. I think in this matchup, their ground games are very similar, with the only real difference, again, being age and athleticism going to Martinez. And I don't know how confident Martinez will be in that going into this fight, so it stays on the feet. And having seen Aldo fight, I do kind of like Aldo matching up in striking. And even then, their numbers are pretty similar. 4.54 landed for Martinez to 3.57 to Aldo. Yes, that's a difference, but Aldo having fought more, that total is a little skewed as of recent with some of his fights. I think he can match up pretty well here. I don't think he'll get the KO, but I think he'll be able to do enough to grind out a win here. For the main event, the champion, 27-5, Alexander the Cannibal Pantoja, looks for another title defense against the surging 12-1 Steve Astro Boy Erceg. Erceg is 6 years younger, 3 inches taller, with only 1 inch in reach rolling his way. Pantoja is an aggressive fighter who pushes the pace on the feet and backs it up with solid takedowns and dangerous submissions. In the numbers, he carries a 4.32 to 3.90 in striking, which does make me point out that his KO ability is more based around quantity over power shots. I do also have to mention that he does want to the ground in most of his fights, which does lead some weird striking totals for his wins. He was outstruck 111 to 95 in his last fight, but won the fight by, I believe, unanimous decision. It does bring up his ground game, where he can really pull away in a lot of fights. He carries a 2.20 average and the ability to pour it on if he doesn't sink in early submission. I will say that the control time does depend on the opponent a little, as he had 15 minutes against Royval off 8 takedowns and 8 minutes off 6 against Moreno. Now Erceg, still pretty new to the UFC, 3 fights again, but I think you can call him an all-rounder, with a definite preference for going to the ground and the submission game with 6 career submission wins. In the UFC, he runs with a 1.69 takedown average and 7 minutes of control off 4 takedowns across 2 fights. 3 takedowns in one in another. Obviously, he has a dangerous submission game that an opponent has to look out for. When it comes to striking, he has a 4.57 to 3.64 and really doesn't strike me as a KO artist, despite his last win being a KO over Schnell. He has 2 career KO wins. But overall, it is good enough to keep him in a fight and set up his ground game. Vegas likes Pantoja by a narrow margin. And I need to stop writing doing this live, because this is agonizing doing it alone in a basement with bright lights and a camera looking at me. But I'm going to agree and run with Pantoja. Coming down here to film this, I was going to pick Erceg, but I've kind of changed my mind rereading through my notes. Erceg can win this fight, no doubt. He's an all-rounder. He's very solid. Preference for the ground game is there, but he's proven the ability to work on the feet against other fighters in this division. I'm just kind of picking Pantoja based on UFC experience, which is always kind of one of those bonuses I call on when I'm desperate for something. And I think Pantoja's aggressiveness in the way he goes after the takedowns, after the striking, I think that gives him a slight edge here, because he relentlessly will shoot and stack whenever he can to rack up the control time and work for submissions. And while Erceg's very good on the ground, if it doesn't go down, has a chance to put something in his head about what Pantoja is doing. This is a fight that either fighter can win. I think they're both very dangerous on the ground, and this could be a situation where Pantoja lands a takedown and suddenly he's in the rear naked choke or whatever. But in this close of a fight, I'm going to go with Vegas. I'm going to pick Pantoja. It's a little bit of a gut feeling, not so much a straight up numbers thing, but I'm going to take Pantoja for UFC experience. He's had a few defenses at this level, and while his striking isn't great, I think Erceg's might be a little better. It's matched up well enough with Brandon Moreno and Brandon Royval that I think he's able to at least hang in on the feet, or give some slight problems to Erceg that might let him set up his ground game or avoid the worst of Erceg's ground game. That's at least my logic. Well, in the end, that's UFC 301, the Hangover card. As I said, it's an okay card. It's a lot of 3-fight guys looking to establish themselves. The title fight's a bit nuts to me. Erceg's only had 3 fights. I thought they were going to give him 1 more for the title fight, but I'm down for it. I think it'll be fun to watch and interesting. I always love seeing Jose Aldo. I just admit it's weird to have him as the co-main event. All in all, it's an okay card. I think it'll have a few enjoyable fights in the end. I'm hoping I got a few of them right to expand this record a bit. But go ahead and tell me what you think. Tell me who you think won, who you think's going to lose. And in the end, have a good fight.